Hi, my name is June. I'm a photographer and videographer based in Vancouver, BC. This is just a series of videos going over camera settings for beginners. This video is going to focus on the setting called aperture. We'll be going into what it is and what are the effects, and then I'll be giving you a couple of scenarios so you can practice applying this knowledge to actual shooting. So to start off, what exactly is aperture? So if you look at your lens through the front and you start changing the aperture, you'll notice that there's an opening that becomes smaller and larger. That's what your aperture is. And the common terms that we use with aperture are things like wide open, f-stop, and stopping down. Wide open is kind of self-explanatory. It's when the opening is at its widest. The f-stop is referring to the numbers. On old lenses, it's written on the side. Newer lenses, not so much, but you'll see this number beside the letter F in your camera settings. It's usually f4, f3.5, f2.8, numbers like those. Stopping down is just making the opening smaller. How wide open your aperture is and the f-stop is, the relationship with that is a little bit counterintuitive. A wider aperture will be a smaller f-stop number. A higher f-stop number, so an f8, means a smaller opening. So now let's go into the effects. The first one is of light. It's kind of self-explanatory. A wider opening lets in more light and the end result is brighter. So if you're shooting at an f1.8, the opening is larger, therefore you get more light coming into your camera, and therefore the end result, the photo or the video, will be brighter. So for example, right now I'm shooting at an f2. If I were to stop this down to an f5.6, the image would instantly get darker. Now the second effect is a little bit more complex. If we make it really simple and straightforward, it's just background blur. And the easiest way to see this is actually on an iPhone. If you go into portrait mode, after you take the photo, open it up, go into edit, you'll notice at the top left that it says f4.5. That is referring to your aperture. You press that and a slider opens up at the bottom. Give it a slide and you'll see at f1.4 the background is very blurry, and at f16 nothing is blurry. It's all in focus. Now this photo did a relatively good job. I tried to record this earlier today and I noticed that it really struggled with blinds, and that's because it's not an actual physical aperture that you're controlling in that slider. If it's a physical aperture, it's not magically controlling blurriness. It's controlling what's called the depth of field, which is just how many things are in focus. So if we think about it in terms of planes, a really thin depth of field might be how thin this iPhone is. And that's the difference between getting your eyelashes in focus and your eye in focus, or the difference between getting your nose in focus and your eye in focus. What does that mean? So if we're shooting a very wide aperture, let's say a 1.4 and f1.8, the depth of field is very thin. So imagine trying to focus on my eye, but you're a little off. You get the eyelashes in focus, but I mean, it's hard to show. Imagine it looking at it from the side. These are my eyelashes, and let's say my eyes are just like a little bit to the left here. There's a probability or a likelihood that you'll get one of these two in focus. So let's say that we stop down to like a 2.8 or an f4. Essentially just the depth of field will become thicker or wider. And if we return to our scenario with the eyelash and the eye, making this thicker means we'll get both in focus, and that's what stopping down the aperture achieves. So essentially, to get things in focus, you need to have more depth of field, which means a higher f-stop or a smaller opening. And a couple of side notes. The first side note being, if your lens only goes down to, let's say, an f4, that's your widest aperture, that doesn't mean that it's impossible to get background blur. Background blur is determined by a couple of other factors as well, such as your focal length and your distance from your subject. So that being said, there are many more things to consider if your goal is just background blur. It doesn't have to just be a wide open aperture. Second side note, applying what we know about depth of field now, if we're trying to take photos of fast moving subjects, let's say your children or in my case cats, stopping down will actually result most likely in more keepers, more photos that we want to actually use, because if we're shooting too wide open, there's a high likelihood that we're going to miss focus on a lot of shots. So in that scenario of a fast moving subject, I would probably stop down to, let's say, f2.8 or even more than that. And the last side note is that if you're trying to shoot something like your living space and you're trying to show off all your furniture, or you're trying to shoot a product photo, then obviously you're going to have to stop way down to about an f16. And that introduces its own set of problems, because as we learned before, that determines how much light comes in. If you're indoors, you want as much light as possible. So if you're going to stop down to an f8, f11, f16, then you're going to have to make up for that with your other settings or external factors. And the third and final effect we're going to go over is sharpness. Shooting wide open gets you more background blur, so you might think that your image is a lot sharper. This is not the case. For most lenses, if you're shooting wide open at its widest aperture, so let's say an f1.4, f1.8, your image will actually be less sharp compared to when you're shooting at f4 or f5.6 or f8. And generally lenses are sharpest between 5.6 and f11. And further, depending on how old your lens is, so this is a film lens, it's a Pentax lens, 50mm 1.2. And you hear 1.2 and you're like, oh man, I can get a lot of background blur with this, but you'll notice that the images at f1.2 are actually quite soft. See that it's a little bit, it's really difficult to get in focus, but it's also, I mean, it looks pretty sharp actually, but it's supposed to be a little bit softer. Once you stop down to f2 or f2.8, that's when you begin to notice that this lens becomes a lot sharper. A lot of modern lenses, however, such as this 35 RF lens from Canon, are very sharp wide open, even at 1.8. Now the thing to consider with that, however, is something called corner sharpness, which, like the name implies, is how sharp the image is in the corners. You'll see a lot of people talk about center sharpness, which is exactly that. Center frame, how sharp is it compared to the corner sharpness? Now more expensive lenses will still have wide apertures like a 1.4, 1.8, and will be sharp across the frame. Comparing those same lenses from f1.4 or its widest aperture to it at 5.6 is most likely going to increase in sharpness as you stop down. And the side note for this section is something called diffraction. I'm not too familiar with the science behind it, but once you stop down to an f16, the image is likely to get a little bit blurrier, and you're not as likely to shoot at f16 indoors, but once you go outdoors on a bright sunny day like today, there's a high likelihood that you'll be shooting, especially if you shoot video at f16 or above. That technically degrades your image quality. I don't really care too much about it, but if you're a landscape photographer, that is one thing to keep in mind. So to end off and recap, just here are some scenarios to consider. Try to think of what aperture you would shoot at. If anything, think about it in terms of, do I shoot wider or do I stop down? First one is very simple. Portrait of somebody and you want as much background blur as possible. Do you stop down or open that aperture up? The answer obviously is open the aperture up. You're going to shoot at f1.4, 1.8, whatever the widest aperture you have access to is. If all you're going for is blurriness, no matter what focal length, shoot wide open. Next one is you remodeled your kitchen. You want to show it off and show as much of it in as much detail as possible. What are you going to do? You're going to stop down, maybe perhaps to an f8, if not f11, and just try to get as many things in focus. The flip side to that again is if it's low light, not a lot of light, maybe you'll shoot at a 5.6, and if that's not enough light, either you introduce artificial light or you just shoot wide open and call it a day. The next one is an interesting one. You're shooting group photos. Let's start with maybe just two people. This is different from a portrait because sure, you can shoot wide open and go for that background blur, but now you have to keep things such as focus in mind. So if you have two people and one person is a little bit forward compared to the other person, then there's a high likelihood if you're shooting wide open that person A will be in focus but B will not. So an easy way to remedy this is just to line those two up to get them on the same plane of focus and take the shot that way. Now in certain shots you might not be able to do that. Let's say it's like a wedding bridal party. There's multiple people and you have to stagger them. 3 in the back, 2 in front. Obviously for these guys, you're not going to be shooting wide open. You're going to be stopping down to get all of them in focus. The last scenario is shooting photos of my cats. The easy answer to this would just be give up. But yeah, you can stop down, get as many things in focus because those guys move a lot. All right, so there's a few more things to consider when you're thinking about aperture and lenses, but all that info is kind of optional and bonus. So I'm just gonna speed right on through those after just wrapping up here. To keep things simple and brief, I don't wanna really overload you with information, but if you are interested in kind of understanding the relationship between lenses and apertures and what that means for buying decisions, then please continue. If not, thank you so much for watching the video up until now. If it helped you in any way, please like the video. If you have any questions, you want to follow up, or things that I said were a little bit confusing, comment down below. I've done photo and video for a while, but I haven't really done this type of explanatory thing. Please give me all that feedback. I'm still very much in the learning process. Okay, so bonus section, lenses and money, essentially. When you're starting out, you probably have a kit lens. And it's probably a zoom range of like 18 to 55 or something like that. And your aperture is probably going to be 3.5 to 5.6. So what that means is that the more you zoom in on that lens, the more your aperture will stop down on its own. So let's say at 18, it's at an f2.8 or a 3.5. By the time it hits 55, it's going to be at a 5.6 or a 6.3, depends on the lens. And as we learned today, that means your image will be getting darker as you zoom in. Now that's okay if you're on an automatic setting, but for someone like me who likes to shoot manual, it's a pain to deal with. So I'd rather just keep my settings, my aperture at 5.6 or 6.3, whatever it is at the end of that zoom range, so that it remains constant throughout. So if that's also a pain for you, because 5.6 is still quite dark and shooting indoors is going to be very difficult, you might be looking at a zoom lens that has an aperture of 2.8 or an f4, anything that is constant though. So no matter how much you zoom in or zoom out, it's going to remain at the same aperture. In those cases though, you will be looking at more expensive options, especially if you're looking for a zoom with the 2.8 aperture. The best way to navigate that is probably look out on the used market for older versions of these zoom lenses. A lot of them are updated multiple times already. The other type of constant aperture lens is a prime lens, and these lenses just don't zoom. They have only one focal length and you have to zoom with your feet. The nice thing about prime lenses is that for less money, you'll get a faster aperture. So a 50mm 1.8, for example, is nicknamed the Nifty 50 because it's very useful, but it's also very cheap. So a lot of beginners will usually have that as their first prime lens, and that will be their go-to low light lens. Now you might outgrow that 50 because on your lens it might be too much of a zoom. The focal length might be too far. So if you want to get group shots, for example, you might not be able to achieve that with a 50mm unless you walk very far away. So in those cases, you might be looking at a 24mm or a 35mm. In crop world, maybe a 16mm lens, f1.4, and those, depending on the brand, get very, very expensive. But I mean, if that's what you want to do, that's what you got to do. The final thing is the farther away you want to shoot. So let's say like your focal length is at 135, 85, or 200, let's say. The lower the aperture for those, just by physics alone, there needs to be a lot of glass and the resulting lens is quite big. So there's a lens by Sigma, I believe. It's a 135 f1.8. And that's a hefty lens just because it's 1.8, and that gives you phenomenal background blur or subject separation, but it's quite big. So to combat that, a lot of people change their camera brands depending on that. So for example, a cropped sensor system such as Fujifilm, the lenses are going to be quite more compact or smaller compared to the full frame counterparts made by Canon or Nikon, for example. In those cases, you can get a much smaller equivalent lens, and that's why some people opt for certain brands. But yeah, at the end of the day, buy what you want to buy. If you're a beginner though, I would highly recommend starting with a Nifty 50 1.8, get a feel for it. But one thing when I was starting out was that I only shot with that 50 because I really liked that background blur, and I didn't really understand the concept of aperture until much later. And once I did understand it, I realized like I missed out a lot on the kit lens. That's a final side note actually. A lot of these prime lenses with faster apertures, you're not going to get image stabilization. So if that's a factor to you, go for zooms or look for primes with image stabilization, such as this 35mm. It has image stabilization built in, which is very nice and useful for photos as well as video. But anyways, that's just a little brief information overload about aperture and lenses. But yeah, thank you so much for putting up with me and watching this video. Hope you learned something. Hope things were clear. And I'll be back again with shutter speed.